The chair I sat in at my parents' kitchen table that Sunday afternoon was the same one I'd sat in my whole life. The one with the wobbly left leg that nobody ever fixed, pushed into the corner beside the pantry door. My sister got the chair by the window. She always had. My mother set a mug of tea in front of her. She didn't set one in front of me. That detail sounds small. I know it sounds small. But when you've been watching those small things stack up for 32 years, you stop thinking of them as small. My name is Lydia. I'm the older daughter. The one who moved back to Sudbury after my first business failed. Who spent 2 years working doubles at a diner off Highway 17 to pay off the debt that wasn't entirely my fault, but felt entirely like my problem. The one my mother introduced at family dinners as my daughter who's still figuring things out, as if I were 22 and not 32, as if figuring things out were something to be ashamed of. My sister's name is Brooke. She's 28. She has a communications degree from Western, a boyfriend named Tyler, who my parents think walks on water, and a smile she turns on and off like a porch light depending on who's watching. That Sunday, my parents sat us both down at the table, me in the corner chair, Brooke by the window, and my father slid a manila envelope across the laminate toward Brooke and said, quietly, the way he said everything, "We want to help you get started." Inside was a check for $80,000. I watched Brooke's face open up like a flower. I watched my mother reach across and squeeze her hand. I watched my father nod, slow and satisfied, like a man who had just done something right. Then my mother looked at me and said, "We don't have anything left over, Lydia. You understand." I understood. I'd been understanding my whole life. What they did have, technically, was a piece of land. My grandfather had left it to my father when he died. 12 acres outside of Espanola, about 40 minutes west of Sudbury, with a gravel road running in from the county road, a stand of white birch along the north edge, and an old tool shed that had been leaning to the left since I was a child. The land had been sitting unused for 11 years. My father had always said he'd do something with it eventually. He never did. 2 weeks after the envelope went across the table to Brooke, my father called me and said he wanted to transfer the Espanola property into my name. He said it like he was doing me a favor. He said, "It's worth something, Lydia. It's not nothing." I almost laughed. The land was assessed at around $40,000. Rocky Canadian shield terrain, thin soil over granite, and the road in needed grading. It wasn't nothing, but it wasn't $80,000 either. And we all knew it. But I drove out there on a gray October morning with a thermos of coffee, and I walked the whole 12 acres by myself. The birches were already bare. The shed was worse than I remembered. There was a low, wet corner in the south end that collected standing water, and I stepped into it up to my ankle and stood there in the cold and thought, okay, this is what I have. I signed the transfer papers the following week. I should tell you that I had worked with plants before. Not professionally, not in a way anyone in my family took seriously, but I'd had a small container garden on my apartment balcony in Ottawa before everything fell apart, and I'd volunteered 2 summers at a community garden in the Donovan neighborhood when I moved back to Sudbury. I knew what grew in the shield. I knew the soil was acidic. I knew what survived and what didn't. That winter, I sat at the small table in my rented room and researched. I ordered books from the library. I read about native plant nurseries, about the restoration movement gaining ground in Ontario, about municipalities and conservation authorities paying for native species to replace invasives on public land. I called the Greater Sudbury Naturalists Club. I emailed a woman who ran a native plant operation out of Massey and asked if she'd be willing to talk. She called me back the same evening. Her name was June. She talked for 45 minutes and didn't ask for anything in return. Before she hung up, she said, "The demand is real, but you have to be patient. The first 2 years are just learning." I had nowhere to go. I could be patient. In April, I used the last of my savings, $4,000 I'd put aside from the diner job, to buy a small greenhouse kit, basic irrigation supplies, and my first seed stock. My uncle, my father's younger brother, let me borrow his truck to haul everything out to the property. He didn't ask questions. He helped me unload and then stood with his hands in his jacket pockets looking at the shed and said, "You want me to help you square that thing up?" We spent a weekend reinforcing the shed framing, re-roofing it with corrugated metal, and building 2 basic growing benches inside. My uncle was 61 years old and moved slower than he used to, but he knew what he was doing with a hammer, and I didn't. Not really. I made lunch. He made the shed stop leaning. That was the whole team. Me and an older man who showed up 2 weekends a month because he had nothing better to do and, I think, because he liked being useful. My parents didn't come out to see the property that first year. My mother mentioned it once, at Christmas, asking if I'd done anything with that land yet. I said I'd planted about 200 native seedlings and was setting up a small retail operation for the following spring. She nodded the way you nod when someone tells you something in a language you don't speak. Brooke didn't mention it at all. The first retail season was modest. I set up a roadside stand on Saturdays in May and June, selling native perennials, wild columbine, swamp milkweed, native asters, nodding trillium starts, to gardeners who knew what they were looking for. I made just over $6,000 that summer. Not enough to live on, but more than anyone had predicted, which was nothing. The second year, I got a small contract with the Conservation Authority for native plantings along a restored wetland corridor. 1,400 plants. I drove them down myself in the truck I'd bought from a guy in Chelmsford for $2,200, a 2009 half-ton with rust on the wheel wells and a heater that worked fine. That contract paid $11,000. I was not sleeping much. I was not doing much of anything except working the land and keeping records and trying to stay warm in a property that had no permanent structure. I stayed at my uncle's place in Espanola 2 or 3 nights a week that second winter, rather than make the drive back to Sudbury every evening. My parents knew I was working on the property. They knew in the way you know about a neighbor's renovation, aware that something is happening, not particularly interested in what. The moment I think about most, when I go back through those years, is a Saturday in July of the 3rd season. I put together a small potted specimen, a beautiful young serviceberry, about 3 feet tall, that I'd propagated myself from cuttings 2 years earlier. Serviceberry is one of those plants that does everything right in a Canadian garden. Wildlife loves it. It blooms in May before anything else. The fall color is extraordinary. I had been growing this particular one in a large nursery pot and it had filled out perfectly. Brooke and Tyler were having a housewarming at their new place, a semi-detached in New Sudbury that my parents had helped them buy with. I later found out an additional $20,000 from an RRSP my father had cashed out. I hadn't been invited to help them choose the house. I found out about the party through my mother, who mentioned it the way you mention weather. I thought about not going. Then I thought about the serviceberry in the back of my truck, and I thought, it's a housewarming. You bring something for a housewarming. I drove to their place after a full morning at the nursery. I was wearing my work clothes, canvas pants with soil on the knees, a flannel shirt, my hair in a braid that had come half undone. I hadn't thought to change. I realize now how that looked. I didn't care then, or I told myself I didn't. Tyler opened the door. His eyes went from my face to my clothes and back. "Lydia," he said. "Hey." Brooke appeared behind him. She was wearing a cream linen dress, and her hair was done, and she looked at the serviceberry in my arms, and then at me, and something shifted in her face, something quick that she covered with a smile. "Oh," she said, "you didn't have to bring anything." "It's a serviceberry," I said. "It'll do really well in your yard. It's native, good for birds, flowers, and spring." "That's so thoughtful." She took it from my arms and held it the way you hold something you're not sure what to do with. "I'll find a spot for it." I stayed for 40 minutes. I ate a piece of pita with hummus and talked to my aunt about her knee replacement. Brooke didn't bring me over to meet any of her friends. My mother arrived while I was there and greeted me with a quick squeeze on the arm and then moved to Brookside and stayed there. When I left, I walked past the side of the house and I saw the service berry sitting on the curb beside the recycling bins. I stopped. I looked at it for a long moment. I left it there. I drove back to Espanola with the radio off, and I sat in the truck in front of my uncle's house for a while before going inside. I wasn't crying. I was past the part where things made me cry. I was in the part where things just settled into you, heavy and permanent, like a rock sitting down into clay. That night I wrote in the notebook I kept for the nursery, Service berry. Propagate 200 more cuttings this fall. The third full retail season broke $40,000 in revenue. I had 3 Conservation Authority contracts, a landscape architect in Sudbury who sent clients my way, and a small but loyal Saturday customer base who started following my waitlist for specialty specimens. I had hired my first part-time employee, a young woman named Simone from Espanola, who knew her plants and worked harder than anyone I'd ever met. I also, finally, had a proper structure. I applied for a small business grant through the Northern Ontario Heritage Fund Corporation and received $18,000 to build a proper retail greenhouse and a small storage building on the property. My uncle helped me with the foundation prep. A local builder did the rest. The night before the greenhouse went up, I walked the property alone in the dark with a headlamp. 12 acres that had been a liability 4 years ago. The stand of birches. The low, wet corner I'd turned into a demonstration rain garden. The rows of plants under frost cloth, waiting. The gravel lot that was now an actual parking area with a proper sign, Shield Roots Native Plant Nursery. I stood there for a long time. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired in a way that was different from exhausted. A settled, earned tiredness. The kind that comes after something real. My father came to see the nursery for the first time that August. He didn't tell me he was coming. He just appeared on a Saturday morning. His truck parked at the edge of the lot, walking slowly along the display beds with his hands behind his back, reading the plant labels. I was with a customer. I watched him out of the corner of my eye. When the customer left, I walked over to him. He was standing in front of a large patch of purple coneflower, and he looked... I don't know how to explain it exactly. He looked like he was trying to understand something. "You did all this," he said. It wasn't a question. "Simone helps," I said, "and I had help with the buildings." He was quiet. He walked a little further and looked at the greenhouse. "Your grandfather would have liked this," he said. I didn't answer. I didn't know what to do with that, and I still don't entirely. He bought a flat of wild ginger and 2 potted high-bush cranberries. He paid full price. He didn't offer to help, and he didn't apologize for anything, and he didn't say anything about Brooke, or the money, or the years of Sunday dinners, where my mother talked about Brooke's promotion and my father listened, and I sat in the corner chair and ate my food. But he came back. The following May, he came back alone and bought another flat of plants. And the May after that, he never once said he was sorry. But he came back, and I learned, slowly, grudgingly, to let that be its own kind of thing. I need to tell you about the phone call. It was a Tuesday in September, 2 years after that first visit, and I was in the greenhouse doing inventory when my cell rang. It was my mother. Her voice was strange, tighter than usual, with something underneath it that I hadn't heard before. She said my father had had a heart attack at home that morning. She said the paramedics had come quickly, and he was stable. She said I should come to Health Sciences North. I drove to Sudbury and sat in a hospital waiting room with my mother and Brooke and Tyler for 4 hours. My father came through the procedure. The cardiologist said he needed to take things slower. My mother held her coffee cup with both hands and stared at the floor, and for a moment, she looked genuinely old. And I felt something for her that I couldn't quite name. Not forgiveness, not resentment, just a complicated tiredness that I think is what happens when you love someone who has never entirely seen you. My father recovered. He was home within a week. He was slower after that and quieter, and sometimes when I came to Sudbury, I would sit with him on the back deck, and we would drink coffee and not say much, and it was fine. It was fine in a way it hadn't been before. He died 14 months later, a second cardiac event, in the early morning before anyone could get there. The reading of the will was held at the lawyer's office on Paris Street in Sudbury. My mother, Brooke, Tyler, and I sat in chairs around a conference table. My mother had asked Tyler to be there for support, which was something I chose not to react to. The will had been updated 8 months before my father died. I found this out at the table, watching my mother's face change as the lawyer read. The Espanola property, which was now appraised at significantly more than $40,000 due to the improvements and the established business operation, was already in my name. He had given me that. But what I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that my grandfather's original land transfer had included an adjacent parcel, a separate 8 acres that had been held in a family trust and had reverted to my father's estate some years earlier. My father had never mentioned it. He had, in the updated will, transferred that parcel to me as well. He had also left the family TFSA, valued at just over $60,000 to me. To my mother, he left the house and its contents, the vehicles, and a separate savings account. To Brooke, he left a small amount of savings and a note, which the lawyer did not read aloud, but handed to her in an envelope. My mother said very quietly, "I don't understand." My sister looked at me across the table with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something more like the look you get when a thing you assume to be permanent turns out not to be. I didn't slam a single door. I went back to Espanola that evening and walked the property in the last of the September light. The high-bush cranberries were heavy with fruit. The rain garden had naturalized completely, sedges and blue flag iris filling in the way I'd hoped, but never quite counted on. The greenhouse lights were on and I could see Simone's silhouette inside, moving between the benches. I had 20 acres now, a working nursery with a wait list for spring, a part-time employee who was starting to talk about going full-time, 3 conservation contracts for the following season. I thought about the serviceberry on the curb. I thought about the corner chair with the wobbly leg. I thought about my mother saying, "We don't have anything left over, Lydia." I didn't feel victorious. Winning had never been the point, even when I thought it was. What I felt, standing in the field in the cooling air with the cranberry branches red around me, was something quieter than that. I felt like the land, patient, not asking for anything from anyone, just growing steadily in the thin soil over the rock, finding the cracks, putting down roots, making something out of what was never supposed to be enough. I went inside, washed my hands at the utility sink, and started the closing checklist for the greenhouse. Tomorrow there was work to do. There always was. And for the first time in my life, that felt less like burden and more like the truest kind of freedom I knew. I'd thought a lot about what my father saw when he walked those display beds that August morning, reading plant labels, hands behind his back, not saying much. I used to think silence from a parent was the same as indifference. I'm not sure I still believe that. What I know is this: nobody handed me a check. Nobody co-signed a loan or drove out on a Saturday to ask how things were going. What I had was 12 acres of Canadian Shield that everyone agreed was too rocky, too remote, and too much trouble to be worth anything. And I had the choice of what to do with that. I've learned that the choices you make when nobody's watching, when there's no audience, no approval, no guaranteed outcome, are the ones that actually build something. Not because hard work is romantic, or because struggle is noble, but because when you have nothing to fall back on, you figure out what you're actually made of. I found out I was made of something that could survive a northern Ontario winter in a leaning shed, that could read soil chemistry from a library book, that could call a stranger and ask for help without shame. That took a kind of honesty I hadn't practiced before. Honesty about what I didn't know. Honesty about what I needed. Honesty about the fact that I was hurt. Genuinely, deeply hurt. by what my parents did, and that being hurt wasn't going to stop me from doing the work anyway. Those two things can be true at the same time. You can carry the weight of being overlooked and still show up every morning and do what needs doing. The serviceberry I brought to Brooke's housewarming ended up on the curb. I've thought about that tree more than makes sense. What I settled on is this: you can offer something good and have it refused, and that refusal says nothing about the value of what you offered. The tree was still a good tree. The intention behind it was still real. What other people do with what you give them, that's not yours to carry. My father came back to the nursery. He came back quietly with his wallet out and no explanation, and I think that was the closest he could get to saying what he couldn't say out loud. I chose to let it be enough, not because he deserved that generosity from me, but because I did. Carrying old bitterness on land you're trying to grow things on is just adding weight to soil that's already thin. What I built at Espanola came from three things, and I didn't have a name for them while I was doing it. I just lived them. The first was doing right by the work, even when the work was thankless and nobody knew about it. The second was thinking clearly, learning what I didn't know, asking better questions, making decisions based on evidence instead of ego. The third was just staying, showing up the next morning and the morning after that when it would have been easier and more comfortable to quit. My grandfather left my father that land without instructions. My father left it to me the same way. What I did with it was mine to decide. That turns out to be the whole story.